Hi everyone. So, in politics, I believe in giving credit where credit is due, not to pander to politicians, but because it's important to look at the whole picture. And with that in mind, I want to talk about Sir Keir Starmer's speech to Parliament. I think it was yesterday. Um, I think Starmer is showing leadership when it comes to Russia and China. And I have to say, overall, I'm quite happy with his position. I think that he is being assertive, and I think that he is on the right side. I mean, it shouldn't have to be said, but because his predecessor was so controversial in these areas, it has to be said. Um, so Starmer has called for full sanctions. He has called for a tough line on Russia, and notably, he has called for Russia Today to be banned. Now, he is the first senior politician I've seen to say that, and that is very refreshing and very important. I'm going to talk a bit about Russia today and then maybe more on Starmer. So, Artsy, I've long felt it shouldn't have a license in this country. And I'm well aware of the retort to that. What about free speech? You know, you just want them banned because you don't like what they have to say. Well, here's the thing about free speech. It has never, ever been absolute. Never. There's responsibility with free speech. Now, Russia Today was funded by ultra-nationalists in 2005, and for the last 17 years, it has been pushing disinformation on an industrial scale about firstly the Georgia War of 2008, about the Syria War, which of course isn't over, and about Ukraine. Russia Today galvanizes from divisions in the West. You will never see a Russia Today report that isn't cynical or critical of the West in some capacity. So, what they will do typically is they will get some controversial issue, usually around the culture wars. It could be around trans issues, it could be around Black Lives Matter, anything like that. And they will go in and they will exploit it and they will talk about it and they will get critics to come on and talk about it. Now, you might think, well, they're just reporting the news. But when they're only focusing on that, then it becomes very obvious that they have an agenda. You know, Artsy will never report anything positive about a Western country, ever. And if someone could show me an example of them showing something positive about a Western country, I might take back that statement. But so far, I haven't seen it. I mean, if there's riots in London or Paris, RT will be all over it. If there is a Western leader whose poll ratings are going down, RT will be all over it. This is not to say that reporting those issues are not legitimate. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not saying that any network shouldn't report them. Indeed, our own domestic networks, BBC, Sky News, and so on, will report some of those issues, not all of them. And that's another reason why I think the BBC's selective coverage is a big mistake, because the likes of RT fill the void. That's why I think the BBC should cover controversial issues like the grooming gangs, like culture wars issues and protests. Um, but I won't beat around the bush on this. I detest RT. I think it's a disgrace to journalism. And an example of this is after the Salisbury attack, which was effectively state terrorism, they got a fine from Ofcom, our media regulator, for their coverage. And I believe there was other violations as well. Now, a fine is pretty meaningless to a network that's backed by one of the world's most powerful regimes. But anyway, Margarita Simonian and other executives at RT responded with scorn and ridicule. They weren't just offensive, they responded with scorn and ridicule. Now, bear in mind, two British citizens had died in that attack, and others had been made sick. The police officer involved couldn't work ever again, I understand. So, this was a very serious international incident. Um, the way I look at it, if those looking at the free speech argument, if Russia doesn't allow media transparency, i.e., if there is serious limits on what CNN and the BBC can report within Russia. I don't see why we should give a platform to a Russian propaganda outlet. I mean, RT doesn't even try to hide its bias. They have all these advertisements. Um, well, one of the things they come out with is watching the Hawks. So the implication is Westerners are warmongers. Watching the Hawks. That's pretty damn rich coming from a network that is funded by the Kremlin. Look at how many wars Putin's had since his 20 years in office. So just a bad joke to talk about watching the Hawks. They never watch their own Hawks, of course. So it's not just the hypocrisy, it's the dishonesty, it's the fact that they will take conspiracy theories and hold them up as news. They won't say this is just the opinion of this person. They will treat that as news and facts. A typical RT tactic will be they'll get a disgruntled employee of the CIA or maybe a failed politician from Britain or America to come and appear on their show to basically have a go at Washington or London. And those people have a vested interest because they have a chip on their shoulder. They've maybe failed in their political endeavors, or they've been fired, or, you know, X, Y, and Z reasons. But they will have a grudge. So they'll go to RT. And RT will lap it up because it just ties into their narrative. Um, Now, you might argue there's bias on both sides. I'm not going to say that Western media outlets are entirely neutral. That would be not true. But you just have to look at the number of journalists who have been murdered in Russia to see that there is absolutely no moral equivalency um, in terms of transparency. Now, Ofcom, I'm very, very unhappy with. I think they've shown weakness to RT. I think it amounts to appeasement because they will say. I remember I wrote to them about this because I feel very strongly about this issue. Their retort was, of course, RT is from a Russian perspective, but that doesn't necessarily show bias. They're contradicting themselves. Of course, it shows bias. I mean, they gave me this lengthy um, link as to how they assess whether or not a network should have a license. The truth of the matter is, Ofcom has the power to revoke a license. They could do that today. But in the 4 years in Salisbury, they've failed to take any significant action. I don't consider fines significant action. I would consider removing the license to be significant action. So hopefully, now that a senior politician has called for that, it will give them a big of a kick up the behind, frankly, to take action. I'm tired of Ofcom showing weakness and appeasement. I mean, what is it going to take for them to act? The evidence that RT has violated our media regulations is extensive. They've sowed disinformation. They've disregarded the guidelines after their fine. They retorted to that with pure scorn. They didn't say we would, abide by these regulations. They just show complete scorn. So what is Ofcom playing at? Why are they being so weak? Why are they being so passive? It really frustrates me, to be quite honest. But I really want to underscore this thing about free speech. Um, we are effectively in a Cold War situation here. Now, should we have allowed Pravda to broadcast in the UK during the last Cold War? Or let me give a more profound example. In the height of World War II, would we have allowed Third Reich propaganda to air on British radio? I don't think so. Indeed, Lord Haw Haw was arrested as a traitor for his propaganda messages, and rightly so. Now, I'm not saying that we're in a situation similar to World War II, but the tensions are very real and very deep. I looked at the Russian embassy website yesterday, just sort of curiosity, and of course, it was very defensive in talking about how the Western side has escalated tensions. The only little snippet of kind of cooperation that they were talking about was the Arctic convoys during World War II, when British sailors and other Allied sailors very bravely helped the supply route in the Arctic convoys, which was a critical part of the war effort. Um, I'm not Russophobic. I take no pleasure from any of this. It's the same stance I have with China. I'm not against Russia as a country. think it's a great country. There's a lot of things about Russian culture I like. I actually like the Russian people. I think that they're intelligent people. I think that they are interesting people. But the Russian regime, Putinism, I think he's a thug. Um, by the way, one of my subscribers mentioned Fudge, who's a left wing American commentator. I looked at his channel and it is interesting. He's clearly well on the left, he's a socialist, but he's anti Putin, and that isn't always the case. So that was refreshing to see. He sees Putin as a fascist, and I don't think he's entirely wrong. Um, but the false flag that Russia has carried out in Ukraine. I mean, for weeks and months they were saying they were going to invade, but that is effectively what happened. I don't know how this is going to escalate. I looked at the latest developments today. But anyway, full credit to Keir Starmer for saying that. I think it's extremely important. Whether it happens or not is another matter. There will be those, not necessarily Russia apologists, but there will be people who don't particularly care for Putin and Putinism who will say, oh, well, I don't like it, but we should allow free speech. I would just ask you to consider that that's a bit naive because there's a lot of things that we don't permit when it comes to free speech. I mean, we don't allow hate speech. We don't allow clear incitement. We have censorship when it comes to things that are harmful to children. I think it is a reasonable barrier that a hostile foreign state shouldn't be allowed to have its propaganda on our soil. I don't think that is unreasonable. RT has had many, many chances to change the approach that they take to be more professional, be more neutral, but they've failed to do that. It's very clear that RT has an anti West agenda. That isn't showing the Russian perspective, that is pushing an agenda. So get your act together, Ofcom. It's pathetic how you have failed to take action. Now about Sir Keir Starmer, I'm not going to on say the things I've said critically about Sir Keir. I do think that it was a disgrace that neither he or Boris Johnson had anything to say about the teacher whose life was threatened in Batley. I don't see that as just a localized incident. I see it as symbolic of a deeper problem with Islamist intolerance in this country. I think it's a disgrace that the young Pakistani woman, Asia Bibi, couldn't get refuge in this country because of the Islamist threats against her in Britain. Now, I want to see Keir Starmer a lot more vocal on issues like that. I'm also not happy with the fact he's too much in tow with the woke left of his party. Um, his attitude to trans issues is a bit pathetic, to be honest. Um, his response to saying that a woman is, I forget the verbatim, but it was put to him, a woman is a biological human female. And he'd say, well, I wouldn't personally say that because he didn't want to offend trans people. Issues like that I'm not happy about. I think Starmer's too woke. However, and this is an important point I look for in leaders, I think that Starmer is definitely far more of a leader when it comes to foreign policy than his predecessor was. I do believe that Starmer is tough on Russia and China. He has repeatedly, consistently called for a tough line in both regimes. He said that we should diplomatically boycott the Beijing Olympics. He's called out the cultural genocide of the Uyghurs. He's taken this tough stance with Russia. Meanwhile, Jeremy Corbyn um, is coming out with his usual stance, blaming the West for escalating this. Nothing to say about Russia, of course. The Stop the War Coalition, incidentally, if I didn't mention this in the previous video, they had a sentence where they were talking about a single sentence where they condemned Russia's incursion. That's a very rare thing you'll see from the Stop the War Coalition actually condemning Russia for once. It was one sentence. Now, the rest of it was, of course, blaming the West because that is their track record. Um, I don't believe that the Stop the War Coalition is neutral. They have regularly appeared on Russia Today. Lindsey German, Jeremy Corbyn, their spokespeople have regularly appeared on Russia Today. They're not neutral when it comes to Russia and the West. They do have selective outrage. Um, they talk about Islamophobia, but they've got very little to say about violent Islamist extremism. So I've got no respect for the Stop the War Coalition, and I don't trust them. I don't buy this idea. Oh well, they've condemned Russia's incursion, so maybe they're not so bad after all. I think the track record speaks otherwise. They have consistently, repeatedly taken a stance that has always been anti-West. Always. So has Jeremy Corbyn. All I could say is thank goodness that man never got to number 10 and his inner circle. It's not just Corbyn, it's people around him like Diane Abbott, Seamus Milne, and others. Um, John McDonnell. Um, so, there's this schism within the Labour Party. I think Corbynism is still very much there. Even if Corbyn's gone, Corbynism unfortunately still has a presence. I've always said I think it is very, very difficult being leader of the Labour Party. I think it's one of the hardest jobs in politics because it's a major political party and it is a party that can govern when it's at its best. Under Tony Blair, 3 terms in office. Um, so this is not a marginal party. It's a major party that should always be taken seriously. But I think the problem with Labour is they have this identity crisis in of themselves. They're almost a victim of their own size, I would say, because a Labour leader needs to balance up so much. So he needs to balance up red wall votes, Brexit voters, bread and butter issues, things that people care about, crime, education, and so on. Yet the woke left in his party is very vocal, and I would say they're quite influential. So, it might be that Starmer's doing a Joe Biden. It might be that Starmer himself is maybe not that woke. He might be quite sensible. I think he's an intelligent man, but he's pandering to them because they're a big demographic within his party. Um, the sort of people who are looking for microaggressions everywhere, the sort of people who are determined to cancel celebrities because they use the wrong pronoun, etc. Starmer's taking the knee incidentally during the BLM protests, I thought was ridiculous. So I'm not going to go out of my way to gush praise on Sir Keir Starmer. There are areas I'm still not happy about. But two of the big pests, Russia and China, I think I'm quite comfortable with his leadership so far. Another thing for right wingers and conservatives who say that Starmer criticising the Prime Minister on issues around COVID and Partygate, um, I disagree. The job of an opposition leader is to hold the government to account. I mean, if you expect Starmer to just blindly agree with everything Johnson and the government does, that is not the job of an opposition leader. I actually think Starmer's got a good balance. He has called out the government when he needs to, and he's supported the government when he needs to. And that's a very difficult balancing act. If he was always condemning the government no matter what, that would be exploitative and cynical. But it is the job of an opposition leader to hold a government to account. That's democracy. Otherwise, we just have a single party state. So I would say actually Starmer has got the balance right. Is he the most dynamic person in politics? No. Is he dull? Yes. But I think in a lot of areas, at least regarding foreign policy, he has got it right. He was recently attacked for saying we should look at Brexit opportunities. Now that says to me that Starmer is not taking those red wall voters for granted. People like in my city here in Sunderland, I voted Remain, but a lot of people in the city voted Leave. A lot of them lifelong Labour supporters. And by that statement, Starmer is just showing that he recognises the strength of feeling there is. Um, and being opposition leader is difficult because until a general election, you basically know that you can't get into power. So you just have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing and be tested on your record in holding the government to account. For some time now, Starmer's personal poll ratings have been well above the Prime Minister's. And I think if there was a general election tomorrow, I actually think Labour will win. Probably not a landslide, but I think Labour would win. And right now, after this, I'll be tempted to vote for Starmer. I'd like to personally put it to him, maybe in a radio call-in or something, about his stance on Islamism, why he didn't speak up at that time. I think it's just unfortunate because I do think Starmer's a capable leader. I just think that he's too much in tow with the woke left. I think there's too many areas um, where he's not assertive enough. But when it comes to foreign policy, you can be absolutely sure Starmer is never going to call terrorist organisations our friends. And Corbyn apologists can say what they want, but that is what Jeremy Corbyn said about Hezbollah. Just a record. It's just a fact. It's not a smear. It's a fact. Starmer was quick to act on the anti-Semitism issue. Starmer is pro-West. I mean, I don't know how you can want to lead a country when you're consistently against that country, as Corbyn has been. On every major international issue, Corbyn has taken the other side. He has consistently played the devil's advocate for Russia. Now, I don't actually think that Corbyn personally likes Putin very much, but it's just, you know, Russia is on the other side, so we have to back that. That is Corbynism. When Fidel Castro died, he made gushing praise to the Cuban dictator. That shows that Jeremy Corbyn is no advocate for human rights. And this is one thing that is intolerable about that side of the left. They're such hypocrites. They preach about human rights and compassion, but when it comes to left wing dictators, they go out of their way to defend them. I'll wrap this up, but Ofcom needs to get its act together. They need to take away the license of RT. I see no valid reason why RT should be operating in this country. I mean, they have a very low viewership anyway. So purely in commercial terms, I don't see much credibility for them being here. Most British households don't have access to RT. Um, but I still think it's toxic. I think it's a weaponized network. I think it's an organ of the Kremlin, and I don't see why they should be here. Um, Especially since Western outlets are heavily restrained in Russia. Um, Free speech shouldn't be including, giving a hostile foreign state ammo to attack us, spread disinformation. So yeah, I would fully 100% support RT being banned. Of course, they'll cry about it and they'll call it Western hypocrisy, so called, but they're a disgrace to journalism. I mean, it's laughable. And I have to say, when I hear British voices on RT, I want to throw up. I wonder how they sleep at night, stabbing their country in the back. And whilst it is not the job of a journalist to necessarily be loyal to one country or another, the fact is, when they're working for RT, they're effectively working for the Russian government. They can't say that RT is separate. They're making fools of themselves if they think that's the case. Okay, so that's my take on RT and Sir Keir Starmer.